loved. And so this morning we have the privilege and the honor to have Romal Tune as our guest speaker today, or actually we're going to be interviewing Romal in just a moment, in a few moments. And so thank you for being here today. And so this is going to be great as we are going to be diving more deeply into Romal's most recent book, I Wish My Dad. And so we're going to be getting into that in just a couple moments. And Tony Ferretti, Dr. Tony Ferretti, has joined me up here to also be a part of this interviewing process. And so we've got some real doozy of questions for you, Romal. I'm kidding. Yeah, so as we begin, we all have experiences with our dads. And as I was just thinking about this recently, knowing that we were moving towards this day and having Romal here, and we're going to be discussing his book, my dad, many of you know my dad died late last year. And I'm still finding myself at times kind of going back and asking the very question on Romal's most recent book. I wish my dad would have been this, or I wish I would have been there more before his death, and since he's up in Michigan. But so we all have those kind of experiences. We all go through life and have. Some of us have very positive experiences. Some of us not so much with our dads, and so we're going to try to encapsulate all of that this morning and move towards healing. Where do we find healing in our stories? And so, Romal, just up front, I would like to begin by just asking you what caused you to write this book? And then also, it's interesting how at the beginning of the book, if you've read it, you will know this, but it starts with an interview that you do with your son.
Yeah, so first, thank you for having me. Thank you, First Church, for this opportunity. It's been really a blessing to be here. I love being around a very kind and generous faith community. So thank you for your kindness and all of the warm smiles that I've received since I've been here. What compelled me to write the book was a visit to see my dad, who now is retired and lives in Texas. And we had a challenging relationship when I was young. I was a very challenging young person to deal with. And my dad, being a two-tour Vietnam vet, had some interesting dynamics. But it really went well. I've done a lot of work on my faith and grown a lot as a believer and as well as in therapy. And so I showed up differently in that interaction. And afterwards, I reflected on the experience with him that day and just had all of these I wish moments, things we had done together and opportunities we had missed. And I felt alone. And I wondered if other people had I wish my dad stories. So I did it not intentionally in the beginning to write a book, but to build community of people so that I wouldn't feel alone. And then solve for how can we build healthier relationships and meet the needs, not just of sons, but of fathers too, through how we show up differently. And so that's how we got here.
Okay, all right. Well, were there any interviews, because the book unfolds with a series of various interviews, with guys and about their experiences with their dads. And so were there any interview conversations that you had as you were writing the book and that really stood out to you and that were more difficult than maybe some of the others?
Yeah, there are some really beautiful stories in this book, and all of them are not challenging stories. Some of them are hard, and some of them are actually quite beautiful. In fact, I've read, my friend Ernest, his story. I wish I had a dad like his. The way he talks about the time they spent together and their plans. His dad was a principal in a school, and he wanted to go back to law school, and they had this plan to both become lawyers and start their own firm. And there were subtle challenges in their relationship that impacted Ernest's life, and that his dad, when he made up his mind, it was not up for discussion. And that then led to a dynamic where, in a very challenging situation, a crisis, I would dare say, Ernest, who tells the story in the book, did not speak up under the assumption my dad's not going to listen anyway, so I'll just remain quiet. And as a result of his silence, a very tragic circumstance happened. But that then impacted Ernest as a leader who's now a partner at a firm, having to heal through his aggressive desire to speak up now because he didn't speak up then. Yeah. There are just other stories. My friend, his name is a synonym in the book. I almost said his real name, but I'm not going to do that. Only because there's two people in the book, because of the nature of their families. I chose to use synonyms. One, his family owns a global brand that everyone in this room would know. He wanted to use his own name, and I was like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do that. But he has a beautiful story of growing up on the family island and always being with his dad, but he never felt really known by his dad. He was nurtured to be an aristocrat, and that really wasn't who he desired to become. And later in the story, his dad wasn't much of a man of faith, but the gentleman in the book really is, very much so. He and his wife, and he tells the story of their relationship. And later in his father's life, he said to the gentleman in the book, "Son, does God hear everyone's prayer?" And he says, "Yes, Dad, God listens and hears everyone who prays." And he said, "Well, son, maybe one day you can teach me to pray." And he said, "Dad, I would love to pray with you and teach you to pray." And that's towards the end of the chapter, but when you hear their story and see how it lands in that place, it's a really beautiful journey. And there are so many others, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe you've already answered this, but this book, as we maneuver and listen to the stories and read the various stories of the people that you've interviewed, really provides hope and healing. And how would you say what is the thing that stands out as far as for you in the writing of this book that offered you hope and even changing your own personal story, and as far as changing, you have 2 children, and so your relationship with them?
Yeah, I think that I'm always a very hopeful person. Just naturally, I'm looking for that glimmer of hope in everything and then pursue it. But the stories in the book are intentionally designed to show that there is hope, even in the midst of challenging situations. Now, granted, some of the relationships, they did not get better. Yeah. There wasn't the opportunity. Their dad passed. But in one story I'm thinking of, a gentleman in the book, Michael Ray, his relationship with his father was really hard. But that has now shaped how he loves his children well and his son. And he tells this story of how when his son was young, he would pray over him and rub his back, "May the Lord keep you and comfort you and bless you," and then kiss him on the forehead good night. And now his son is in his 20s, and sometimes they'll be at the airport after his son has come to visit. And, over the years, he would rub his back and pray that over him. And he says now, in his 20s, I'll hug him at the airport, and I'll start rubbing his back, and he says, "Don't do it, Dad." So, but he's used to that rhythm, and it's a beautiful thing. And he made the comment once. I hug my son, and I do kiss my son on the forehead. And there was a time when his son said, "Dad, when will you stop kissing me on the cheek?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, son, when would you like me to stop?" And his son said, "I think I'm a big boy now. You don't have to do it." And years later, his son came back and said, "Man, I wish I hadn't done that. I miss you hugging me and kissing me on the cheek."
Wow.
So there's always this hope, and there's this. The book points out these opportunities for conversations where men and their sons, and even just entire families, are given the space to share their emotional needs. And that's a big intention of the book. My editor, as she edited the book, said, "I never knew men were so emotional." And I'm like, yeah, we just aren't always given permission and safe space to share how we're really feeling, and our need to hear "I love you," and our need to be hugged and feel okay like everyone else. Sometimes we're just told, be strong, carry it all, and no one gives us the space to say, it's actually really hard, and I don't want to have to just carry it all. I want to be able to talk.
Well, thank you, Romal.
Yeah.
Well, first off, I want to say thank you for writing this book. It's a fantastic book. I haven't gotten all the way through, but even in the first couple of chapters, actually the chapter on Ernest that you mentioned, I thought of my father, who I couldn't really speak to openly because he was not that emotional guy, and he sadly passed away when I was in my 20s. So I could totally relate to this book and some of the things that you are addressing. So I wanted to ask you, what was missing in your childhood that you needed to become an emotionally healthy person?
Wow. It's interesting, now looking back and realizing what I needed and what would have given me more confidence and reassurance in my own identity. And when I reflect on that, I think about my grandfather and my uncles who raised me. I met my father later, and as I mentioned, he's a two-tour Vietnam vet. So being a touchy-feely guy was not going to be a good expectation of him. But one time, just real quickly, my dad told us, my brothers and I, the story of when he was in Vietnam, and he was in a demolitions unit, and he had to go look for bombs and mortar rounds. And he got shot, and he was sent back to the States to recover, and he signed up to go back. And we said, "Dad, why did you go back?" And his response was, "To find the guy who shot me." And I was like, this doesn't sound okay, but but when I think about my grandfather, even my dad and my uncles who raised me, my reflection is this: I wish they raised me through the lens of assumptions that were tied to my life being similar to their lives. In other words, if his life is going to be like mine, he's going to work hard and have a job that's highly demanding. He's going to need tough skin and not be sensitive. He's going to have to be strong and have a lot of courage. And so if his life is going to be like ours, then he is going to need the skills that we needed. Tough, not thin-skinned, not getting caught up in your feelings, that we can't make him a soft person, right? Because life is going to be hard. I wish they would have prayed and asked God, who is this child going to become? Because God could have given them a vision of who I was becoming that was bigger than their stories and what they did not accomplish, or their assumptions around the difficulties of life. In the Bible it says your old men will dream dreams and your young men will see visions. And I think that's because when our older men dream those dreams, they will share them with the young men, and that will give them a vision. And I think that that requires prayer to ask God, who will this child become that is not tied to who I am? And that would have allowed them to raise me differently and realize that my journey was not going to be as hard, that I did not need that type of mindset to approach the life that I was going to have. So I didn't hear the words, "I love you." I mean, for my grandfather, it was like, "Hey, you live in my house, you eat my food, you're welcome." Like, this is what love looks like. But I would have loved to have heard him say, "I love you," more often. And even my uncles, I would have loved to have received a hug when I needed it. So, and realizing that the same needs we had then when we were younger, we still have now. All of us still want to hear, "I love you, you're worthy, you're enough." All of us every now and then need a good hug to feel okay and not alone, and just to have people present to us. So in ways that we need it, not in ways that make them comfortable. So it's a book that shows that those needs and are still yours, and you're still worthy of having those needs met, be it by your father or other people in your life who love you.
So you mentioned in the book and also here that you've been in therapy before, and I'm kind of a big fan of therapy, you know. So, so how have you found it to be helpful to become a better father and person?
Yeah, so my journey in therapy was hard to start because as a follower of Jesus, I was often conditioned that the answer to healing anything in your life was prayer and prayer alone. And I did pray, and I love to pray, and I seek God all day long in subtle ways at times, just whispering a prayer or whispering a word of gratitude and being mindful of the Lord. But it wasn't that prayer wasn't working, it's that I wasn't doing my work. And therapy allowed me to look at the parts of my life that were hard, that I didn't want to see, and realize that the ghosts were not as big and hard to conquer as I thought they were. As one of my friends says, you know, "You will know your ghost and your ghost will set you free," is one of his sayings. And I found that the intention at looking back at the hard things is not simply to feel it again, but to overcome it and take dominion over it as a follower of Jesus, to realize that you are not your past and you are not your pain, that through Jesus you are bigger than all of it. You are still more than a conqueror. And when you take dominion over those past hurts, they submit to the will of God, and you are able to use those things now as tools and a part of your testimony to be a vessel of healing for other people. And so therapy, in essence, in confronting those stories and healing, I've been able to write books and tell the stories. This is my third book. And that has allowed me to use those things, the past, rather than letting the past use me. And I find that therapy has also allowed me to have a more intimate relationship with God, where I'm not afraid to boldly approach his throne of grace because I don't see God through the lens of my intimidating father. I see him as this loving, gracious God. I'm able to be honest with God because I don't see him through the lens of my family judgment and shaming, but a God who welcomes me every time. And so therapy has allowed me to see God and pursue God more aggressively without this fear that was tied to my trauma.
Good, thank you. So how many of the fathers, that you interviewed, how many of them had the opportunity to say to their fathers what they wished for? And were they able to forgive their fathers?
Yeah, and all throughout the book, again, there are stories where forgiveness was required, and there are stories where that was not the case. In every one of the stories where the men had an opportunity to have a conversation with their fathers, it's been really beautiful to see. So there are 17 stories in this book, and that includes the conversation between my son and I. And for those who have had the chance to do it, it's been the same for all of us. It's awkward because, you know, you have to create this space to have conversations around, Dad, I would like to hear you say I love you more often. And then you'll have dads who will say, well, man, I'm glad you said that because I've been wanting to talk to you and call you more often and spend time differently. And I'm sorry that I wasn't able to do that. So someone, because of their stories and reading what's happening in the book, it's giving people permission to try. And in trying, I've been hearing back from people saying, yeah, it worked. Like my dad and I, our relationship has grown in new ways. We are able to talk more about just life and not, you know, how's your job going and, you know, are you paying your bills? It's like, no, how are you as a person? Are you doing okay? And to even have dads now, after a really good experience with their sons, saying, man, thank you for the time, and I really enjoyed that. It felt good. This made me happy. Rather than people just assuming the other person knows. It's giving voice to how good it feels when you're affirmed and you get the time, because it makes the other person want to do it more. Every man in the book, every single one, wished their dad said, I love you more often. Everyone would say, I know my dad loved me because he was a provider. They could talk about all of his activity as evidence of love, but they all said, man, it would have been great to hear it more often. Every single man in the book also said, I wish my dad hugged me more often. And in many of those stories, it was typically after a mistake, where someone messed up at a sporting event and they lost because of the kid or something like that, but they were admonished for the mistake alone. And it's not that these things live in opposition to each other. And fathers have learned through the book, wow, I can be firm when necessary, but that does not have to take place in the absence of affection. I can still say, hey, you need to discipline yourself and you need to, you know, practice more or study harder, but you know what? I love you. And my love for you is not tied to your performance. I simply love you because you're my son. And then hug them in that moment. So one thing doesn't need to happen in the absence of the other.
Yeah, so one last question that I had is, so as, you know, so like you say, so many men learn to compartmentalize their emotions, you know, put them in a box. And your book highlights the whole notion of speak it in order to heal from it. Yeah. So as these men and you know their relationships with their sons and their fathers, as they move forward, what can they do and what have you done to maintain that focus of connection?
Yeah, you know, yes, the speak it, I want to address that real quick. You know, the Bible says that obviously we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. The thing about that is you cannot conquer what you are not willing to confront, right? And so when we speak it and we confront it as followers of Jesus, we are able to conquer it. And most of the time, what we are conquering is our fear of rejection. Much of our silence in these situations with our children is because we're afraid of rejection, just like kids are afraid of rejection, right? Those things don't go away when we become adults. I'll say one more thing about that. I've, as an adult and a dad, been redeeming play in my life. And my last birthday, I went to Xcaret, place in Mexico, and a resort, and I was walking around eating cotton candy and all the different things, and it's like, these are one of the joys of my childhood. Now, granted, at 54, I got to watch my blood sugar when I eat the cotton candy, but I can still have a little. But I think with this book, for me, having that first hard conversation with my son, I remember it was my birthday when I asked him about being a part of the book. He said, what do you want for your birthday? And I said, I want to interview you for the book. And his response was, are you sure you want that? And I was like, oh God, like, maybe this is a bad idea, but I said, I do. And we both knew it would be hard. The night before, I didn't sleep well because he was going to college at the time near, so I knew what time he was coming, and I was anxious. And he told me after the interview he did not sleep well at all either the night before. And the conversation has led to why I'm so intentional now, because it was hard. And I realized that it wasn't the ability to give him the space to share his lived experience with me was easier because I've been doing my work. Because in the conversation, at first, he would not be fully honest. And he would say, well, you know, when things happened, and I would have to say, when what happened? He was like, well, you know, and I stopped him. I said, son, you don't have to protect me from myself. I know who I was. And I know I wasn't a very good man at the time. It's okay. Well, after that, it was all gloves off. So,
The floodgates
the
open.
floodgates opened, but I had, because of being in therapy and almost modeling what a therapist does, I just listened. I asked open questions to let him give voice to his lived experience and with me, because whether we talked about it or not, it was still true. I did not have the conversation for myself. I did it because I didn't want my son carrying baggage that was never his to begin with. And that I've done enough work on myself and my faith is strong enough that I can carry my own stuff. And I didn't want him to have the weight of those hard things as a young man going out into the rest of his life. Now, you know, I have a daughter who's 26. And I plan to interview her for the next book, Daughters and Dads. I will not have to tell her it's okay to tell me about myself. I'll have to tell her, slow down a little. But men and women have found gifts in this book because although there are these father-son stories, it's the story of the lived experience and desire to hear I love you and to be hugged and to see the importance of affection and to also see that healing is possible even when you did have a hard childhood with your dad, that you can show up differently. Now, even with my own father, a friend of mine said, you know, your dad's in the fourth quarter of his life. My dad's 78. And he said this, he said, you have done enough work. Your faith is strong enough, you've done enough healing, and you are able to love your dad the way he needs it, even if he's never able to love you the way you need it. And so for me, that is true. My dad hasn't done the work that I've done, but he's still worthy of me loving him the way he needs it, because how he shows up does not have to dictate how I love him. That I am guided by the kind of man that I desire to be in the world and how I desire to model who Jesus is in my life. And so he was right. Whether my dad says I love you more often or not, I can say it. But he has gotten better. The consistency now is, the last time I saw my dad, when he walked me outside, he hugged me and he kissed me on the cheek. And he said, I love you. And I said, I love you too, Dad, and I'm sorry it took so long. And because I've done my work, I was able to hug like a little longer, and so I'm holding on, and he's trying to get out of there, and I'm like, no, this is good, like, stay here. So just constantly living into it and seeing that I am not only becoming and living into the kind of person I desire to be, but I'm able to model for my son and other people in the healthiest way that I can. This is what love looks like. I'm man enough to say I love you. And I'm man enough and healed enough to hug you when you need to be hugged, and sometimes when I need a hug. That all of that it guides my consistency in continuing to push forward, tell the stories, do my own work, and be a better person for my family and the people that I come in contact with.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, so just in wrapping up, is there any stuff that you would like to share with us that we haven't covered? And
I think in closing, at the end of the book, there's this paragraph that I share with people. I don't have it memorized, but in essence, it's basically where I'm talking to the readers of the book and reminding them that, one, your story is not over. There's still more story to be written around what love looks like. That every day there's the opportunity to do simple things through the power of our words and simply say, I love you. I remember the first time I sent my kids a text message saying that, like, hey, just wanted to say I love you. And they responded, are you okay? Is everything all right? And because it was not normal, but now it is normalized. And that we can normalize love just through our words and reaffirming each other, our spouses, our children, our friends, who, yeah, will be weird at first when you say, I love you and you are worthy of love. But over time, realizing that it's something people need to hear. A hug is something that all of us desire. The toughest man you know will melt when you hug him because we need compassionate touch. Our daughters are in the same boat. I've had so many women who have read this book who have said, this has resonated with me, and this has been helpful for me to have conversations with my dad. And in closing, I would say that my desire through this book and through the work that I do in these conversations is to let everyone know that you are worthy of the love that you desire. From God, yes, but from the people who love you. That you deserve to be loved and know that you are not alone and that there are people who walk with you. And there are people who are loved by you that would love to hear you say it, would love to spend more time with you, to get that text message. And so I simply wish everyone a life of fulfillment, a life of peace, a journey of healing, and just simply a life well loved.
okay. Thank you so much, Romal, for being here this weekend. And just, it was powerful yesterday, and it's been powerful this morning. And just the stories that are shared in this book and really connect us with our own stories, and that there is hope in each story, hope for healing. And so would you join me in prayer? Gracious and loving God, I just give you thanks that you are the Father who welcomes all of us, regardless of our stuff, regardless of our brokenness, or turning away from your love. God, your grace continues to be a persistent grace, a grace that pursues us, never gives up on any of us. And so wherever we find ourselves in our own story, God, may no one leave this place today feeling that they are not loved. And for those of us who are dads, God, I pray that we would get in touch with our own stories and find the healing in our own stories and our relationships with our fathers, and then also passing on that relationship to our children. And just not holding them up to a standard of you do this and then I'll love you. But I love you, period, for just who you are. So thank you for bringing us, Romal, this weekend, and thank you for this great congregation here and the lives that are being changed and the lives that have been changed, and we're all on a journey. None of us have arrived. And so just thank you that you have a future for each one of us, and it's a future filled with hope and good things. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. And all God's people said, amen. Amen. Thank you again.